Est-ce que vous pensiez que le routing côté Frontend était un sujet résolu? Si oui, eh bien c'est une grave erreur. Détrompez-vous, détrompez-vous. Et pour ce premier sujet de l'après-midi, Eduardo nous fait voyager. Il nous fait voyager dans les coulisses des API qui façonnent nos applications web. Et il va nous faire découvrir une nouvelle interface qui pourrait bien tout changer. Mesdames et messieurs, sous vos applaudissements, Eduardo.
Okay. All right. Hi, everyone. I have to say this is my first time in DevFest Nantes, and I'm really so impressed by the quality of all the graphics, everything. The whole ambience is really crazy. So honestly, bravo, c'est incroyable. Now, yeah, my name is Eduardo. I'm Spanish, but I live in France, and I do speak French. So if you want to come afterwards, talk to me in French. Yes, it's my second mother tongue. I have two mother tongues. I'm a front-end nerd. I'm a freelance, but I work mostly on Vue and open source. More specifically, I'm the author of ViewRouter, Pinia, ViewFire, and other smaller libraries. You can find me online as Posva or esm.dev on Blue Sky as well, which is not ECMAScript module, it's just my initials. And I've been working on the core team for 80 years now, and I've been maintaining the router for over 5 or 6 years, right? And over all this time, not a lot has changed regarding how the router works, how everything is implemented behind the scenes, and even how we use these APIs. Or at least, well, there is one thing we have left behind, mostly, is hash routing. Now, usually, when you think about an application, you have a URL. And the URL is what connects whatever you see on the page to the location, the bar. For a multi-page application, that looks like this. But if you do a single-page application, changing the URL also means doing a reload, doing another server request, etc., etc. So what do? We can do hash-based routing. The hash is the only part of the URL that is not sent to the server. It never goes there. Now, and we can also react to these thanks to the onHash change. And it works, but it has a lot of problems. For example, it's not indexable. SEO-wise, it's not something you want to use, you don't want to rely on. But there was a time where it was the only possibility. So I want you to travel with me a little bit back in time to 2009. This is 16 years ago. And imagine you want to develop your routing, your SPA, your client-side routing. So you Google because there is no AI, so you cannot ask ChatGPT how to do this anymore, or to research it for you. So you Google this, and you'll probably end up on Stack Overflow, the OG, where you're going to have this question with a lot of upvotes. You can actually do this already. You will find this reply. How to do hash, how to detect changes in hash, and you will find this. And so the question you just ask, how do we detect when the hash changes? Which is fundamental if you want to implement an SPA, right? And among the answers, you will see this one with a lot of upvotes saying that HTML5 specifies this hash change event that is supported by all modern browsers. And among the list, you are going to find some oldies like Internet Explorer 8, but also Firefox 3, Chrome 5, which is interesting when we think about nowadays Chrome version, I think, is 141, so it's one single digit. It's pretty cool. And also what's interesting is that this person is saying is now supported by all modern browsers, but Internet Explorer 8 was released on that very same year, which was 2009. Oh, wait. No, it came out in 2008, but it replaced Internet Explorer 7 on 2009. Now, if you have worked with Internet Explorer, I think you know how hard it is to migrate your users to a new version. And so I'm going to give you a little glimpse of what the browser market share was on 2008. Knowing that, first of all, I'm only caring about Internet Explorer, and you're going to understand why in a moment. And also that the only version that supports onHash change, the feature that we need to do single-page applications, is Internet Explorer 8. Now, this was the year of the release. So yeah, there is not a lot of people using this version of Internet Explorer. But more importantly, 70% of the of all the users are using Internet Explorer 6 and 7, which do not support these features. The other 30%, I mean 20-something, is, well, Firefox, Chrome, and other browsers. You get the idea. But what does this mean for us? We cannot use on has changed. It's just trash for us, right? We all have to wait a little bit more. So how do we do? Because we do have SPAs on 2009. Now, think about when you were a kid and you're going somewhere, you're traveling by car, you don't know if you're there yet. And with your limited knowledge of the world at this age as a kid, you keep asking the same question over and over. Are we there yet? Are we there yet? In other words, have we changed the location we are at? In computer science, we call this polling, and it's a real thing. And in fact, it's not just a real thing that we can do in some cases, but we can also hack it and use it in ways, well, we wouldn't use it nowadays. This is the actual code that you can find in some libraries like MooTools to handle, well, hash location changes. Polyfill, if you wish to call it. It's not really a polyfill. But basically, every 200 milliseconds, you check if the location has changed, more specifically the hash. And if that's the case, you trigger your internal navigate function, and you change the last hash to redetect. And in fact, this is the validated answer on Stack Overflow. You even have some little bit of jQuery there for the nostalgia. Now, of course, I wouldn't recommend to do this to anybody nowadays. Polling is something very useful, okay, but not for routing. But what I like about this first reply is that it has it really brings a lot of hope, a hope of, hey, you have this new API, and we can use it now because all modern browsers support it. And I'm sure you've all felt this way of seeing a new feature, and then you check the usage, and like, no, I cannot use it yet. My client wants me to support this old version of the browser. But this is 2009, and I think it has been a decade that we could use. I mean, Internet Explorer was a bit of a pain in the ass to migrate away from, but it was okay. It was fine to use Internet Explorer 9 for a long time, and we could use these hash change events. So eventually, this day where all modern browsers could support this feature came, and I think this hope is what brings us today to this new API called the Navigation API, which I think is going to revolutionize a lot how we handle all the routing in our front-end libraries, but also in our applications and other interactions with the URL without having to care about the framework we are using. If it's Vue, React, Angular, we don't care. Now, I've been talking about routing for a long time. I initially started talking more about what modern routing will be. So it's more about the architecture of the routing and how we use these internal APIs, the web APIs, to make it work. But the Navigation API initially came out under another name that you might have heard about, which is the App History API. And it was 4 years ago, actually. A bit more, it was February, so I think it's closer to 6 nowadays. Initially, it was a proposal by some people in the Chrome team under Google. And of course, it was not supported by anybody except for Chromium. Now, of course, I'm including Internet Explorer there, but as you all know, as time passed, it died. Rest in peace. Thank you. And nowadays, except from Internet Explorer not being in the picture anymore, nothing has really changed. Well, the name is Navigation API, but the support is still not there. Firefox still doesn't support it, but it's very close to releasing it in nightlies. Safari only nightlies. And even in Chrome, you still need to enable one feature flag to have the full set of features, which makes you think, because it means that they might not be aligned about all of the specific implementation details and some very complex interactions between the browser UI and the API in JavaScript. And the main question is, why? Why does it take so long to ship such an API? Right? What is so complicated about this API? Because it's been 4 years, and we still aren't sure if we're going to be able to use it in the next version, or if maybe it's going to get dropped. Now, more about that later, but the reason behind this is because we're playing with a major part of the browser and its API that it's very rare. We are dealing with UI, the address bar. We're dealing with security. Where did they come from? Where are they going to? So in the end, we're touching a lot of surface areas of the browser. And it's not that simple. You have a lot of things to think about, a lot of things to control or, how to say, more reject or isolate from each other, especially in the JavaScript. Now, think about the URL bar. Now, the way we interact with it most of the time is the router. We don't use an API directly. We don't mostly use React router, Vue router, whatever router you want. And we always go through there. The router is the actual entity in our system that is communicating with this URL. And inside there, we also have other components, like whatever matches specific routes to a specific component, et cetera, et cetera. So I want you to give a little glimpse to the API underneath that powers every router pretty much nowadays, which is the history API. Because it's not going to disappear anymore. I know we know that things are not going to work like that in JavaScript, so we have to live with it. And in this API, it looks very naive on the surface, very simple. We have two functions. We have one event listener and a couple of properties on an object. Now, I want to know who has manually and recently 5 years, used this API in a full stack application that had a framework like Vue, React, Angular. Who has used it? 1, 2, 3, 4, OK, more. 10, maybe 15, 10 to 15 people. Still not that many. Who enjoyed it? 1 person. Nice. Very, that's a happy person. This API is not great, let's be honest. Now, let me talk you through the basics of how it works. We can call push state, and it's going to change the URL, push this little piece of state, which is the first argument, and we're going to see that, well, now we can click the back arrow on the browser. The state is whatever we passed, and the length of the history, as if it was an array, is 2. If we push another one, we're going to get a new state, new URL, a 3, and then we can go back. The state changes, the URL changes, but the length is still 3 because we still have 3 entries, and we can go forward again and repeat. Pretty basic. I think we all know how a browser works nowadays. I don't need to tell you a lot about this. From a design perspective, in terms of API, it disconnects a little bit how we handle the URL compared to a link. And this is going to be important. Now, when we think about the URL, in reality, we're talking about 3 things, even though we are just handling one chunk. The path, or also path name, the query, also known as search, and the hash, also known as fragment. And, well, the domain, which I'm not going to talk about, but it's like the premium part of the URL because it's the only one you have to pay in order to change it. And all these little sections of the URL can be accessed through the global object location, with the names path name, search, and hash. But not only read, but also written. If you change any of these properties, it's going to trigger a new navigation. And hash is the only one that does not reload the page. It's the only one that actually stays on your page. For example, for scrolling, but it's not tied to scrolling specifically. Also, it triggers pop state, also, by the way. Sometimes, depends on the browser, so something you cannot really rely on. Anyway, as I was saying, you can change the URL through location.href or any other properties, and this is the navigation. But if we want to do an SPA, we cannot do that, so we have to go through the history push state, passing whatever state we want, the second argument, which is useless, and the URL. And the way this API works, the way it doesn't give us any information about when this is called from any part of the application by any library means that we never or almost never end up using this API directly. Because if we have a router, then the router is not aware, unless we monkey patch the API, but then it's just the same game as polling. So we end up just calling the router push, replace method, whatever we use. And that way, the router is always aware of whenever we are triggering any navigation. So basically, we are wrapping the calls of the JS to get around the problem, because we don't have a proper API. And this is not the only part about it, right? if we have a link, well, we cannot use that anymore because that's going to reload the page. Now, some will argue that you can add a global click handler to the page to detect that. Honestly, I'm going to say the same. Polling hacking is pretty much the same. So you do what? You have your own custom component that is going to call behind the scenes the router .push or whatever function you have. And this makes everything work correctly. But it also means that you lose native features like scrolling or scrolling restoration, to be more precise, and other features that are a bit newer, like transition views. You have to trigger them more manually, and all the CSS interactions. Everything that comes natively, you have to rework a little bit around it, which is a shame because, well, these intentionally worked before, right? You could navigate with these features, and now you have to use something else just because you want to use a data-driven approach with whatever framework you want to use. And also, sometimes the frameworks have to do a lot more work to make sure that the feature, or rather, the workaround for the feature is consistent across browsers. So when we look this history API, what's the issue with it? Well, so many things. Title, it's a documented argument which is unused, completely useless. I'm not joking about it. It's just initially it was meant to give you, I think, the title on the history. When you long press the back button, you can see all maybe it was supposed to change the title of the document. I'm not so sure. The fact is you always pass an empty string because it's useless, and it's the shortest version you can pass. State and URL could have been swapped. When we are, I know the function is called push state, but the important part is really changing the URL. The state, you don't always push a new state, but the point of changing the URL is more important. Then we have this replace state, which could have been an option. Replace true. I don't know why we have two functions. We have an event on window instead of history, even though we do have a global object that is new. And then we have all these other problems with history. What about the other entries? Well, you cannot see them. You only get access to the current entry, and that's it. Length, as if it was an array, but not really. What does it really mean? It also changes based on how many entries you have in the past. What can you do with this information? Nothing. Also, if you have an AI frame, they also interact with the back and forward button of the history, and so the length can change. It's a bit of a mess. The good news is that the new API is coming, and we can have a very smooth migration if you already know how to use the history API. We have one function, it's called navigate, which is also more meaningful. We have the URL first, and then we have all the other options that are not always needed. And we have this new navigate event, which is going to be very interesting because it's going to trigger anywhere. And I'm going to talk about this a few times because this is really important. And then we have access to every entry. We don't have this useless state of the current entry. We can access the current entry with the state, also where it was coming from. We can access the amount of entries if we want, et cetera, et cetera. Now, you might be thinking, wait, isn't this a security issue? It would be. So this new API is focusing on the same document navigation, and this is very important. Most of the time, you don't care about the iframe navigating. The iframe care about itself, but the document where you're developing your application, well, doesn't care if the iframe navigated. So you don't get access to the state of other documents, and you cannot get entries of, for example, the entry the user came from the search results onto your page. Okay, you cannot read that information. So everything is sandboxed. And I think it's one of the reasons the API needs a lot of thinking and design is that there is all this part where you can overflow into other contexts that you're not meant to read. Anyway, so it makes a lot of sense for the security. Now, let's talk a little bit about the navigate function. The navigate function by itself, it's closer to location href. So if you call this function, it's going to trigger a new navigation, just like changing the location. It's going to reload the page by default, for example. I mean, by reload, I mean doing a server request. It executes what we call a full navigation. So it means that we also have scrolling and can be cross-document if you want. So you can navigate to another domain, for example. That works very well. But also, we have a promise, which means that the navigation can now be delayed in a way. The navigation can take time. Push state doesn't return anything. In fact, you don't even know when the URL is really changed. So some browsers might change it immediately, while others will change it after one tick, for example. But there is no consistent behavior, so you cannot really get a precise moment when you know the URL has changed after calling the push state. And last but not least, we can roll back. We can go back to any entry or forward. This is going to be a traversal in the future. We're going to call that traversal. Now let's dive a little bit into what we can pass here. The URL, we know it, okay? But we have this state, which is pretty much the same as the history state, but it's disconnected from the history, okay? Anything you pass in this new API is not going to be reflected in the history.state and vice versa. For security reasons, because they have different scope, makes sense. Otherwise, it's pretty much the same. Clonable objects. If you pass a date, it's going to get cloned. If you pass a symbol, a function, a class, you're going to have an error or serialization, for example, for classes might be serialized into an object. I'm not 100% sure right now. Info is a new kind of state that is transient, which means that it only lives during the navigation. Once the navigation is finished, confirmed, the URL change, everything, this info is lost. It's not persisted anywhere, differently from the state, where if you reload the page, go back, forward, you're going to see that state in the same place. And my favorite, history. Now, history is what allows you to control if you do a push or replace. And it's my favorite because you don't need to pass it anymore. I mean, it's going to have the, in my opinion, best behavior by default with the auto version. So by default, in auto, it's going to push if the URL changes, and it's going to replace if the URL is the same, which is what you want in most scenarios. For example, something I see very often is in search, when you have filters applied. You still want to preserve the history of the filters. So if you change a few features, let's say we are looking for coffee, and you check Arabica, and you check other kinds of coffee, or if they come from Colombia, or they come from, I don't know, other places. If you go back in the history, you want your filters to go back to the version you were just before, and you don't want to go back to the search results where you were from Google. And this happens because we sometimes use replace a little bit too much, and it's better to always, there are always exceptions, but to always use push if you're changing the URL. Of course, you're not going to use push if the user is typing text, because then you're going to have one character for you're going to have in the history one entry per character the user type, which is a little bit annoying. But this is a nice push into the right direction. All this information is later passed into this new navigate event, which is very cool because it triggers on any kind of navigation. That means a link, push state, changing the URL. Changing the URL is a bit different, but changing the location, changing the hash, anything you do natively will trigger this event. Navigate also, okay? And then inside of that event, you get access to a lot of features. Here I'm just giving a bunch. You have the transit info. You get a destination. You know where you're going, which is something you couldn't do before exactly. It's more like, well, the location already changed. I'm just telling you. Here, we really get into we have an event that we can cancel as well. Not always, but we can cancel. And we have the navigation type, which is, for example, something that you couldn't do reliably before. You could find ways to emulate it most of the time. But you will get some very specific scenarios where if the user reloads the page, then you don't get the right navigation type because it overrides some of the state. It was a bit more complicated. Basically, now you know if the navigation is going to replace, push a new entry. Also, if the user is just reloading the page by either clicking or doing reload. There is a function, reload. And traverse, which is navigating between history entries. Now, these are kind of things you cannot polyfill, so this is why I'm really excited about this API, is that it brings a lot of information I really tried so hard to get right in the router, and I managed to get it right for many scenarios, but not consistently on 100% of the scenarios. And the craziest part is that you can intercept the event, and you can control how the URL is updated, but also when. So you have this commit option that is not related to Git. It gives you two options. immediate or after transition. Now, transition here is nothing about CSS. It's just that one navigation is going to get called. I mean, when a navigation is intercept, we are creating a transition because it's going to take time. So we have this state that is in transition. And so this handler can return a promise. This is why it's async. And inside, we can do things like, well, fetching some data, updating the DOM. It's up to you. Now, this is a very simple version. And you're going to notice that I added a few things up there. Because it triggers for absolutely everything, you have to filter out the events that you do not care about. If the user is requesting a download link of anything, you probably don't want to intercept that. Form submission, same. Or some events cannot be intercepted. For example, going to a different domain, well, it's a bit complicated, but some cases cannot be intercepted because the browsers do not want you to trap the users in some specific pages. For example, if you click too many times on back or forward, even if the page has a confirm model, which is browser native, so it blocks the rendering process and the thread, you can still click multiple times on the back browser, and you're going to get back anyways. You're telling the browser, hey, shut up, I want to go back. And so these kind of events, this property is going to tell you, hey, no need to call intercept is going to throw an error if you actually call it. But you can do anything you want there. You can intercept or not the navigation, and it's going to delay. And how does it look like? It looks like this. Here I'm going to click on a few pages around, and you're going to see that the loading spinner on the tab appears. Now you see the logs. Now this is a very rough playground. The point is really the top of the page, the spinner. There was just one single request to the server in all this video, the first one. Everything else is just the navigation API and intercepting the event. And that interception is going to delay the navigation, and is going to automatically trigger the UI of the browser for the loading spinner. Now, this is something we couldn't do before. We cannot control the UI of the browser like that. In fact, there are very few APIs that allows you to control the UI of the browser, and this is one of them. And one of the obvious things to think about is what happens inside of the async handler. Now, of course, because you have a promise, it can reject or resolve. Now, the actual behavior of the navigation is a little bit more complicated later, but you get two events that are dispatched on this navigation global instance, which means one thing, and it's the direction I want to go, is that all these API, all these functions, these events, what they are enabling is an agnostic, just a JS version for interacting with the history and knowing when something is happening. You don't need to rely on the frameworks anymore. The browser gives you this information, okay? Which means that you no longer have, I hope, we no longer need to create specific versions of libraries that are just for Vue, just for React, when it comes to these URL interactions, because we can intercept these events without using anything specific to any framework. And this is really the coolest part. And for example, we can imagine that we have multiple intercept as well, right? Many libraries can have their own intercept. And you can have then navigation success used to update the DOM in one place and maybe show an error if there is an error. And then you have other libraries coming in, and they can add their own intercept there. And you can also know, because there is a signal, so again, using modern JS APIs, you can know with this signal is if any other of the interceptions have already thrown. So you can stop any workload you put into this interception before going deeper. And all these, when you have multiple interceptions, what happens is that they get all merged into one single transition, which is what I was talking about before, is that when a navigation is intercept, you get what we call a transition. This transition contains two properties, finished, contains more, but two promises, finished and commit, I think. The most important one is finished because it really is the one that lets you know that everything has changed, the whole interception flow is finished. Commit is relative to the URL. Did the URL change? Because you can have different commit options. So it's a little bit more specific, but they are there for a reason. You have a few other things, like where are we coming from, the navigation type. And these are types that we have seen a little bit before. So we have the promise of the currently intercept navigation. We have our previous navigation history entry, which is it's something that we're going to look into a little bit later. And we have the navigation type of the transition. Now, this is interesting because this is a global property, which means that anytime in your code, you can check if there is an ongoing navigation without having to care about what router you're using. So again, going in the direction of, I don't need to do something specific for any framework. This is JavaScript again. And so this navigation history entry is the same you can see on the current entry, which is similar to the state, history of the state, but contains a little bit more. First of all, the current entry is really the first one, so the last one on the, depending on how you look at the, the list of the entries. Also, every entry knows their index in the array of the entry, so that you have a lot of information to work with. And we have a few extra properties. We have two UIDs, the ID and the key, the URL, and a function to get the state. Now, I really like the function to get the state because the history state is a property, so you can read it. But sometimes you might think that you can write to it, but if you write to the history state, it simply does nothing. It just ignores that, doesn't give you an error or anything. The only way to change it is with replace state. Here, we have a function to tell you, yes, you are getting a version, you are reading the state, but you're not writing to it. If you change it, well, it's just a copy. Now, why do we have ID and key? Let me show you. When we are interacting with all the entries on the history, the ID is going to reference the specific object as an immutable version of a history entry. The key is going to reference the entry in the history, kind of like a pointer in a way. You can think it that way. Which means that if, for example, we change the state, we update current entry, which is another function to navigate, the ID of the entry changes, but the key stays the same. The key is stable, is navigation stable. If you keep pushing to the history, the keys are always stable, which means that we cannot always go backwards into or forward into any history entry with this function, traverse to. Now, I think this is really good because it's something you could implement yourself, right? With a little bit of workarounds and trouble, but it's so useful. If you've been through any long form, and I think at some point in your life we all gone through complicated forms, even just sometimes some travel planning can be very long. You probably want to go back in some specific step. Sometimes you want to skip a few steps behind. And if they implement anything wrong, you might lose your whole form. And I don't know if this happens to me, but I get really scared about going back in some forms because I've lost all the work on forms before. The idea is that I think this feature will make it easier for developers to make a better, a better state management in terms of form, because you should associate the state of the form with the URL and the navigation so that going back and forward doesn't change anything, and the user can fully change any step of the form no matter where they are. And this also means that, well, you don't have to deal with these magic deltas of history go, but also no more forward and back, not knowing if you're getting away of the application. If you go forward or back and the next entry on the history is another domain, then you're going to get out of your application, and that's life. In the navigation API, you can check if that's going to be the case, and you can control not to call the forward or back function, which is something you couldn't check anymore before. You can mostly implement it for 90% of the cases, but there are a few cases that you cannot control, which is really nice. And all of these functions, all of the navigation functions, give you promises, give you the finished and commit promises that you know when they are finished. If you want to do extra stuff, normally it can also mean that the DOM is updated, not necessarily, depending on the implementation of the router and the front-end framework. This is the only place where, well, I guess you still depend on the front-end framework a little bit. But it's really nice. So let me summarize a little bit everything. With the navigation API, every single navigation are observable, no matter how they are triggered. Okay, there is no more hacks, there is no more polling to do through the navigate event. You can control the loading, so the UI, thanks to the event intercept, which is nice. You don't need to create your fancy, how do you call these, the loading bars that we see in all the applications. The idea, I think, is at some point this is going to be the native UI of the browser. Now, currently, not all browsers implement these. I mean, they don't implement the full API anyway. But for example, in Chrome, you will see it, but in Safari, it doesn't do anything. Safari nightly, by the way. So you can get access to any ongoing navigation to, well, change whatever you're trying to do. If you want to trigger a new navigation, you might want to check the ongoing navigation first. Then you get access to all the history entries and the state, the previous locations. You can do a lot more interesting stuff with that. And you have these kind of permalinks, which is a full new features. Okay, you could mostly implement before, but not 100%. And now we have an app promise, which is something new. In other words, navigation API is pretty much the new version and better version of the history API. I think there is no there is no debate around it. What does it mean for libraries and for applications? Well, for libraries, it means that we get a consistent API that has predictable results and is extensible without having to wrap around it and create little hacks. So less abstractions as well. But for applications, it means that you have lighter routers that do not have to get around. And for those who like it, I won't judge, but you can do micro frontends. And the routers shouldn't get too much in the way. For example, in the case of view router, if you manually change if you do push state manually, you might break it if you do it the wrong way, because you're not meant to go through the push state, because that way the router doesn't know something is happening, so it cannot trigger all the navigation guards and all the extra stuff, right? And now the question, the million-dollar question is, where are we at? Can we use this? We cannot use this yet, as you were seeing in the initial slides, but we are there, we're getting there. So it made its way into the HTML spec, okay? So right now, if you go, I think it was a bit recent, right, when it was merged. It was open for a long time, basically. But it got merged into the specs, so you can see it online. In the page, we get all the specs of the HTML. And Safari and Firefox, which are the two browsers, vendors that are not shipping this API yet, already have their tickets that you can look at. Recently, both of them were very active into implementing more and more features. And the reason, I think, it's because it was implemented into Interop, or rather added to Interop 2025. Now, what is Interop? Interop is, if I understood well, an initiative by some of the vendors. So Safari WebKit is a vendor, Chromium is a vendor, Firefox or maybe Gecko is a vendor. And they all try to get together and say, okay, what are the important new features that we should all implement so that we can provide a baseline of features that all the developers can rely on. And now this is, so I took a screenshot a few days ago, so it's looking much better from the initial version when I looked at it in the beginning of the year in March. For reference, the past years, I think it was 99 or it was over 95% of the features in Interop 2024 got implemented and released into the browsers, which is a good thing. It gives us hope again. And if we look at the graphs, they are rather promising. This is all the active focus areas, as you can see on the select, and this is the navigation API. Now, why this peak? This is apparently the way they handle does this browser implement the feature or not is dependent on the channel of the browser. And I think that in Safari, it was in technology preview for a long time, and then or under a flag that was not activated, and then they toggled it on when they had enough features, so it basically peaked like that. It's still not there, and Firefox, you cannot see it, but it's a 0. Okay, I'll tell you that. It's a 0. Even in the Firefox is a little bit different because they don't have the feature flags the same way as Chrome and Safari. It's a little bit more complicated, in my opinion, to use as a user for these features. But it should be getting there, and we have all these. They are a lot of tickets in the bug tracker that you can see. Now, if you want to try it out, make sure that if you're using Chrome or Edge, enable the experimental web platform feature flag on your browser, because it's, at least the last time I tested, it's what enables having multiple commit options. Otherwise, it always updates the URL immediately. You cannot delay updating the URL with the intercept. And there is a lot more. Okay, there's a lot of new interesting APIs that are new. URL is a bit old, but for example, pattern is a very cool API that allows you to create matchable patterns instead of writing regex or using path to regex. Very cool. Should be also fast, not always, but should be fast. And there are a lot of things that are making routing better, and for libraries author, but also for application and developers. And if you want to see how the navigation API works, get a look into their spec. It might sound a little bit more frightening than it is. It's easy to read. It has a lot of examples. There is a lot of vocabulary. I'm not going to lie. It was a bit hard to read the first time. Then you get used to it, and it's really nice. Very interesting read. Very long, too. I hope you give it a try. If you use Vue or something, or come see me around. I have a few stickers, not that many. I didn't ask, but who uses Vue here? A few. Cool. They missed it. A lot of people don't use Vue and came to the talk. That's great. And I hope you have a nice conference at DevFest. Thank you.